And I see now that we are at noon, so I'm just going to do a quick last reminder here that our chat box is going to be closed throughout the webinar, but we will have our Q&A box open, which should appear in your toolbar. There have been over 25 questions that were pre-submitted, and our speakers will try and answer as many of those as we can. And our webinar has closed captioning. If you'd like to use this feature, you can click on the CC button on your toolbar. And if you'd like to turn off this feature, press more and select hide subtitles. So since we're at 12, I'm going to turn it over to Sean and we'll get started.
Thank you, Chelsea, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Price, and I'm the Executive Director of Alumni Relations at the University of Alberta. It's my privilege to welcome you to the 6th installment of the North American Energy Dialogue Series, which brings together energy experts from Canada, the United States, and Mexico. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. We're truly grateful to have the opportunity to work, study, and live on this land. And we're grateful to our panelists and our viewers today that are joining us from other territories and throughout the world. Energy is a topic that unites us all across borders and fields, touching every part of our society. The University of Alberta, the University of Texas at Austin, and the Tecnológico de Monterrey are leading research-intensive universities, each with strong energy-focused expertise, and each contributing a unique global lens to the energy systems issues facing us today. Over the past 2 years, our 3 universities have come together to create this webinar series to enable discussion and analysis on energy technology and policy with perspectives from government, academia, industry, and think tanks. Today, we continue this series with our session, The Future of Oil and Gas in the Age of Decarbonization. Today's panel discussion will examine the economic, political, and social contexts of oil and gas development in each country, discuss potential future trajectories, and consider the consequences of transitioning too quickly or not quickly enough. It promises to be a very interesting discussion. To moderate this webinar, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Juliana Liang from the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Alberta. Dr. Liang is a professor and researcher here at the U of A and a principal investigator in the Future Energy Systems Research Program. She's an expert in reservoir engineering and specializes in reservoir characterization, data analytics, history matching, process optimization, reservoir simulation, geostatics, thermal solvent-based heavy oil processes, and unconventional fractured reservoir modeling. She and her team are currently using artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques to optimize processes for non-aqueous extraction in the oil sands. Dr. Liang received a PhD in petroleum engineering from the University of Texas at Austin, and she's also worked for Shell Canada and ExxonMobil upstream. Over to you, Dr. Liang.
Thank you for the introduction. And to facilitate the discussion, I have a few slides just to kind of set the stage. So we're looking at the future of oil and gas in the age of decarbonization today. Sorry, I should try it again. So decarbonization generally involves reducing fossil fuel consumption and increasing low carbon power generation and using more renewable energy sources, increasing energy efficiency. And this is an important part of a broader effort in reducing GHG emissions. It's also part of the energy transition. According to different sources, for example, the total indirect GHG emissions from oil and gas operations over 5,000 million tons of CO2 equivalent back in 2020, according to the 2020 report. And And indirect, that means it's not directly related to the consumption of oil and gas, but just from the oil and gas operations. And even within Canada, the oil and gas sector has contributed over 25% of the total GHG emissions. So that's definitely something that we're interested in trying to reduce. But this whole issue is quite complicated. While governments worldwide have set various net zero targets, the pathways for achieving these targets are actually not very well defined and are often quite uncertain. That's why a lot of the forecasts, including those that are published by reputable intergovernmental agencies, often show a certain demand for oil and gas beyond 2050. And part of it is related to the fact that oil and gas are used as fuels, but they're also used as feedstock for a lot of products that we use in our day-to-day lives. And I think recent events in Europe certainly demonstrated another dimension, which is that the economic, political, and social factors also shape the demand for oil and gas, as well as the role for decarbonization. So the focus of today's panel discussion is to explore some of these issues and how the oil and gas sector could affect the way our societies decarbonize. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce our three speakers and going from the north to the south. So I'm gonna stop sharing, and I would encourage the panelists to turn on the camera as I introduce them. So first of all, we have Kris Smith. He's the Suncor's VP of Downstream and responsible for operations of Suncor's refining network in North America. This includes the distribution and marketing of refined products, as well as Suncor's renewable energy business. He received a BA with honors from the University of Alberta in 1992 and a law degree from Dalhousie University in 1995, and completed the advanced management program at Harvard Business School. Kris joined Suncor's oil sands business, where he managed business services, strategic planning, production planning and logistics, and operation of Suncor power generation, transmission asset, and utility operations. He also sits on several boards of directors, including Canadian Fuels Association and Actual, Canada's largest STEM youth outreach organization, and the Evoke Innovations, a technology and innovation fund established by Suncor Energy and Cenovus. So welcome, Kris, and thank you for joining us. Our second speaker is Richard Chukla. He's the director and lecturer in the Energy and Earth Science graduate program at the University of Texas at Austin. Richard retired from ExxonMobil in 2015 as executive after a 37-year career focused on the extractive industries. His career as ExxonMobil has included assignments in minerals, which include base and precious metals, coal, oil and gas exploration, development, research, management, and as a senior corporate strategic advisor to the management committee and CEO. Richard has a master's in geology from UT Austin and an undergraduate degree from Cornell. Thank you for joining us, Richard. And then we have Mr. Merlin Cochran. He's the executive director of AMECI, a nonprofit civil association in Mexico that brings together the main operators of oil and gas investors and operators in Mexico. The affiliated companies are of various specialties interested in investing in Mexico and committed to carrying out safe, responsible, and sustainable operations. Merlin was previously the Deputy General Director, the Secretary of Energy, and Rig Manager for the Arabian Drilling Company, and spent several years with Schlumberger. Mr. Cochran has an MBA from Columbia Business School, London Business School, and a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Tecnológico de Monterrey Executive Program at the Harvard Business School. So thank you for joining us, Merlin. So now we have the three panelists. So let's begin our first part of this panel discussion, which is the moderated discussion. And after that, we will move on to some Q&A, answering questions from the audience. So I guess to start, my first question would be that could each of the panelists maybe give us a general view on how the oil and gas sector in the respective country has evolved over the past 5 to 10 years in response to the energy transition, considering the existing political, economic, and social landscape. what could be the role of oil and gas and as the industry continues to evolve in the context of decarbonization? So maybe we'll start with the same order that I introduced, so maybe I'll start with Kris.
All right, thanks. Can you hear me, Juliana?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And thanks again for the invitation. As a proud U of A alumni, I'm really pleased to be able to join you guys today. You know, and I'll keep this brief because we don't have a lot of time, and I know we'll branch the conversation out. But in terms of your question around Canada and how is the oil and gas sector evolved with energy transition over the last 10 years, I'd say 10 to 20 years, and it's been quite an evolution, and I'd say it's really accelerated in the last 5 in particular. If I go back a little over a decade ago in our upstream, and Canada, remember, Canada has the world's 3rd largest oil reserve, and it's predominantly the oil sands in northern Alberta, and was on a platform to grow and was growing fast through the early part of the 2000s. And if I go back 10 years ago, the focus was not so much absolute emission reductions as it was emissions intensity reductions. And there was no carbon tax in place, but there was certainly a drive by the energy industry from a sustainability and emissions and GHG perspective to become more efficient to drive down their emissions. Alberta, the province where the oil sands are located, was the first jurisdiction in Canada to actually put a carbon tax in. That was a number of years ago, which really started to drive more focus on reduction. And here we are sitting today in the last few years that the Canadian federal government has now instituted a carbon tax nationally. So the regulatory environment, the carbon tax environment's changed dramatically over the last number of years. And the upstream industry has moved, I would say, from a focus on growth and emissions intensity to growth, optimizing, and driving absolute reduction down. And I can talk a little bit later of some of the things that the Canadian industry is doing in that regard. But that's been a real change, I would say, in the last 5 plus years. And we're seeing industry really start to do some different things to line up to drive absolute emission reduction targets that are aligned to the country's goals. In the downstream, I'll just talk about it briefly. Obviously, as Juliana said, I lead the downstream business for my company, though I've worked in the oil sands as well. In the last 10 to 20 years, it used to be a focus on renewable fuels blending from a volumetric perspective. It's really changed dramatically over the last number of years. And one province, British Columbia, brought in a low carbon fuel standard similar to California, which was really driving the carbon intensity of the fuel. And now this year, the federal government will be putting in a national low carbon fuel standard. And so industry's working to put in the technologies, the investments to drive the carbon intensity of the fuel pool in Canada down, not just focus on volumetric blending of renewable fuels. And there's lots of things that are going on in that space too, which I'm happy to talk about. But I'd say, Juliana, the way I would describe it is Canada's, certainly our federal government has been lined up with the international goals around net zero and driving carbon reductions, I would say, is trying to take a leading role, and has certainly been trying to put the regulatory frameworks in place that the industry will line up to. Now, there'll be another conversation later, I'm sure, of, well, how fast, how can that happen? You know, what are the practical realities of trying to achieve that? But that's I think the macro I'd give for the folks listening around where Canada's at today. And I'd say we're leading in some areas in the regulatory space, but we're in the same place as much of the developed world. And how quickly can we move and cost and technology to achieve those goals?
Thank you. What about in the US, Richard?
Yeah, I presume you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to be really quick here. I will encapsulate it in a few bullet points. One is the emergence of shale, both shale oil and shale gas. And the net effect has been to make the US the largest producer of hydrocarbons in the world. I would say the growth of the US LNG export industry is an enormous story. US was slated to be importing LNG only 15 years ago. Probably in another 5 years, it'll be the biggest exporter of LNG in the world. The shale story is not entirely positive story. For much of the development from, say, let's say 2014 to about 2018, this was a industry where the focus was on growing production rather than profitability, and it really turned off a lot of investors. So another bullet point here is significant underinvestment in the oil and gas industry. Here in the US, certainly, that's starting to change, of course, with higher commodity prices. But worldwide, we're seeing a huge underinvestment in the oil and gas business. And we're seeing the effects, put aside Ukraine, put aside Europe, we're seeing the effects of higher prices as a result. The oil and gas industry is powering the energy transition. That's just very, very obvious. And if we impair that, I think we impair the energy transition. The last thing I'll say is that at least the US corporate oil and gas companies have been slow to embrace renewables. And they will take, I think they need to take a leadership role there. And you're starting to see that develop with a number of the different companies. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Merlin, how about the perspective from Mexico?
Yes, thank you very much. I'll set the stage first as to what has happened with Mexico. Oh, sorry, I realized my camera's not on. Apologies. So I'll start by setting the stage of what has happened over the last 10 years here in Mexico. We had an energy reform that basically what happened is that they opened up the country to foreign investment, also national investment, but basically to private investment so that they could come here and search for oil and gas in the vast acreage that the country does have. So what has happened ever since? There were more than 100 contracts signed. We've had north of $43 billion invested into the industry through these contracts. Sorry, not invested, approved investments, close to 20 billion of investment. So, I mean, Richard was talking about underinvestment. I mean, Mexico has been underinvested for decades, no? So we're starting to grow this, and we're starting to see production here. And what does that mean to your question about our environmental record over the past years? We know we could say that our record has improved dramatically because our production has decreased dramatically. So that's not the best way to factor that in. What is a good way to mention that our record has improved dramatically is that we've shifted the conversation from emissions to usage to what was mentioned before as intensity. No, so today in terms of our regulatory framework, you need to basically use the gas that you are emitting at a very high intensity or factor. We've also have plans as a country to reduce, and this was, by the way, signed between the US, Canada, and Mexico back in, I believe it was 2016, when the country decided to reduce their greenhouse emissions, and especially methane emissions, by 40 to 45%. So a lot has been done in terms of reaching that target. As I said, we've started on the right foot by reducing the production, but then as we've evolved, we started to talk about intensity. And today, this is part of the embedded conversation. We have also benefit from having foreign companies here drive a discussion that was not present in Mexico, that is now talking about what does the source one or source two emissions here, and what should be done about it. And that's totally new for our country. So we've benefited from opening up, and that is to say that Mexico is no longer a single island entity that is producing and injecting whatever production they can to the world. Now we've benefited from best practices from all of the different countries, and we've also collaborated, by the way, heavily with our counterparts in the US and Canada to bring this in. So yeah, quite happy about this, and happy to talk about more about it in the next session of questions.
Thank you. So the panelists kind of touched on some of the things that probably the industry is moving towards in the future. So I guess the next question I have is, we often hear concerns about us not transitioning fast enough, right? So realistically, how much faster can we really transition, like given the current oil and gas consumption and the demand? And along that same line of thought, is there downside, for instance, for transitioning too quickly? So maybe this time I'll ask Richard to go first then.
Okay, you've put me on the spot here, but this is a question I like to address. I'd be the first one in line to say I'd like to see us transition to a fuels with low carbon footprint or no carbon footprint as quickly as possible, as quickly as makes any sense whatsoever. But I think in general, at least in the public discussion, that transition is made to sound by some people as something that can happen very rapidly, and it is going to take decades to happen. I think the issues, interestingly, are not about the cost of renewables technology. I mean, on a unit cost basis, whether it's wind or solar or other sources, they're extremely cost competitive, but there are many other pieces to the story, and they include, for example, the infrastructure. And there is such a legacy infrastructure that is in place for the oil and gas industry. Replacing that or building something in addition to that is costly and time consuming. So my personal view is we have to take a honest view of what's ahead of us, because to say things are going to be zero carbon 10 years from now, I personally think is disingenuous, much as I'd like that to be the case. Wood Mackenzie has a great chart that they put together, and it superimposes a lot of projections of oil and gas demand, oil demand actually in this chart, oil demand. It's interesting because the majority of oil companies, you might say they are as kind of self-serving sort of projections, but show an increase through about 2040, 2050, although the rate of increase is starting to diminish. Wood Mackenzie has a low carbon scenario that they show that has some challenging objectives, and that gets us down to a slight diminution of hydrocarbon oil use by, say, 2040, 2050. But then if you look at what it will take to get us to 1.5 or 1.6 or 1.7 above pre-industrial levels, we're talking about changes that would move us from around numbers 100 million barrels per day to about 60 by 2040. It is an incredibly big change. The only industry company that is got a projection that might be similar to that is BP's with their net zero scenario. So most oil and gas companies, you look at their projections, it'll put us in the +3 degree scenario plus. And, if you get down to, say, 60 million barrels per day consumption, you could get down to about 1.6, 1.7, arguably. So it's a challenge, a really big one.
Kris, do you have something to add to?
Sorry. Okay, sorry, technical difficulties. I'm going to echo Richard's comments and add a little bit. This is a huge challenge for the world. This energy system has been built over a century, and I think any reasonable forecast would say that oil and gas is going to play a huge part of the energy mix for decades to come, though it should decline. I think, in some of the things Richard was quoting, like Wood Mac, or if you look at IAA, the debate becomes of when does peak happen, how fast can it decline? And substitution is not that easy. And even though solar and wind, and by the way, we invest in wind, cost curves have been coming down, but it's not a substitution for transportation, because you need to solve other things in terms of transportation, as an example, or chemicals, or those types of things. And so it's only a partial solution, electrification, and how fast you can move. So, at 100 million barrels a day, and likely growing, because the developing world is increasing demand as well. And then how quickly can the developed world pivot in energy transition becomes the question. And it's a very complex question to answer. And I think industry, I think Richard said it earlier, I think the oil and gas industry is actually the best positioned from a scale and technology and industrial perspective to actually make significant pace. But the pace isn't in a decade. I think significant ground can be made in a decade, but we're not getting to net zero in a decade. And I don't think anyone reasonably would think that. But we have to do some big things, and we have to start now. And I'll give you the example in the Canadian oil sands space. So the Canadian oil sands emit 70 megatons a year. It's 10% of Canada's emissions. And the 6 largest oil sands producers came together last year in the Oil Sands Pathways to Net Zero Alliance. They represent 95% of production and are working on a foundational carbon capture and sequestration project. Where we have the geology in Canada, the technical expertise, and we know where the carbon's being produced. And this technically can be done. And we're seeing the Norwegians work on it with their Northern Lights project, Equinor, Shell, Total. It's being worked on by the Dutch in Rotterdam. But we have the capability to have massive carbon sequestration, which would make huge immediate impact over the next decade to 2 decades in absolute emission reduction from production. But it's going to take that type of scale and industry coming together and working with government and stakeholders, and it needs the right fiscal and regulatory frameworks as well. You know, in the US, 45Q has helped with the carbon capture industry there, though that hasn't been perfect by any stretch either. We also have great natural gas reserves. Love Richard's point about shale. Actually, the US has probably reduced emissions more quickly than anyone because of the shale gas revolution. And so in Canada, we have the ability to quickly move to cogeneration off gas. So I'll give you another quick example. We are installing in our oil sands business a cogeneration facility that will allow us to shut down our coke-fired generation, export to the grid. And as we know, those of us in Alberta, we have coal-based generation in the grid. It actually allows us to get off that more quickly. And that'll take 700,000 tons of emissions out of our base production and also help decarbonize the electrical system in Alberta. But it takes that type of scale investment. And the last thing I'd say is on the fuel side, there's lots of technology, and I think Richard made it's a good point about cost too. Costs can come down, but we will run up against other barriers. And one example would be feedstock. So the rush to renewable fuels, and my company's invested in it as well. Matter of fact, Chevron yesterday or the day before, Richard, I saw announced a $3 billion acquisition of a renewable fuels company in the US. But it's reliant on biofeedstocks or agricultural feedstocks at this point in time. So we're going to run into some barriers. So now we're working on the next technologies. Can we make fuel from waste? Can we make fuel from wood mass? Can we make fuel from CO2 itself? And these things are happening. Industry's working on it. But the pace will not be as fast, I think, as people want. But we can get big things done. I'm confident in that.
That sounds great. So Merlin, how about in Mexico?
Thank you. It's hard to add to what my previous 2 colleagues have just mentioned, because I couldn't agree more with them. It's going to take time. Pace. It's not going to be something that will happen overnight. But what I do want to mention is that the oil and gas industry is part of the solution, and that's the biggest paradigm shift that we need to all understand. It's not like it's us versus them, and we need to eventually shift one or the other. We all need to work together. This is the only way that we're going to transition to a net zero environment. And previously, they were mentioning how the oil and gas industry can help here. In Mexico, what we also have it's a vast amount of shale potential. As a matter of fact, 43% of the prospective resources here in Mexico are unconventional resources, both in shale plays and deep water assets. And that's just the future. If we want to be able to tap into it, well, that's the future where Mexico has its oil and gas industry. And it can be done properly. No, I mean, we can benefit from the learning curve that the US has had. Of course, there's been some hiccups along the way, We all need to be cognizant of that. But today, the industry has matured to a point where it is done in the most environmental friendly manner. And there's, I mean, the regulators, all of the different stakeholders are there to hold us accountable to this, no? And I mean, obviously, everybody knows compliance is a major issue to all of the different companies working around this. So, I mean, the message here is it can be done well, but I would also like to finish up by saying that we need everybody working together on this. We talked about scale through this discussion. This cannot be done by the companies themselves. If we want, for example, talking about CC, carbon capture and sequestration, here in Mexico, you do need the alignment of the federal government, state government, municipalities, and everything to be able to do it. And I'm not just talking about subsidies, perhaps. I'm talking about the infrastructure. Why? Because it is only the government that holds, at least here in Mexico, the mineral rights to, for example, caverns, salt caverns, where you could make this more profitable for everybody that wanted to invest here in Mexico. So it is through that collaboration of the government and the companies that this can move forward. And I'll just leave it there and then continue to the next round.
Thank you. So I guess from that, we get the sense that obviously some industry players have made very specific commitments to also reducing emissions and improving efficiency. But we also recognize that not every player is at the same stage towards that goal. So what do you still see as the major challenges that the oil and gas industry face? And are there any additional technological developments and policies that you think are key to solving those challenges? And also, are there certain areas or actions where there are already major consensus across the sector? And also, are there any opportunities for cooperation? So maybe, Kris, do you want to start?
Sure. That's a big question. And so, you know, I'd say the barriers and challenges right now, and the world's facing it, and we're seeing it in Canada, is harmonization of policy, regulatory frameworks, fiscal frameworks, collaboration. This has to be, you know, as Merlin was saying, this has to be a industry, government, stake. This is everybody has to be working collaboratively together to achieve these types of, you know, big goals, and the type of investment and the scale of it that's required. And, you know, to give you the example here in Canada, you know, there's 10 provinces, there's 10 different renewable fuels regulations across them. There's a low carbon fuel standard in one province. We're now going to have a national low carbon fuel standard. We've got a national carbon tax, but each province can have equivalency. And meanwhile, our biggest trading partner, and where we export the majority of our oil and we also trade products back and forth, is the US. And the US, you know, California is very different than Kansas. And so regulatory frameworks are really important. Certainty around policy so that the right decisions can be made around investment is really important. Fiscal frameworks, and I agree with Merlin, like this isn't about subsidies, but the right fiscal frameworks, right tax frameworks, as an example. Credit frameworks are incredibly important. In a world where credits will be generated, having different frameworks around carbon credits is not helpful. And already governments are talking about carbon border tax adjustments. So how that gets sorted through. I think those are some of the biggest barriers right now. I actually view the technology barrier as not the biggest barrier necessarily at this point in time. It's the scale and the frameworks and the amount of investment that needs to be done to make progress on this. We will need technology solutions though, and we have to have an innovation ecosystem in the country and globally to drive the right innovation. And for example, sustainable aviation fuel. There's a lot of focus on sustainable aviation fuel. Well, the innovation, the technology to make cost competitive sustainable aviation fuel, that's a little bit further behind the curve than some of the other technologies. And so we continue to need innovation in the system as well. Even around carbon capture, we need to drive the cost of carbon capture down. It's not an inexpensive solution. So anyway, those are, I think, some of my thoughts. I'll pass it over to one of the others.
Sure, maybe Richard.
Yeah, I would absolutely big check on the alignment of policy with the long-term objectives. So I completely agree with Kris and Merlin on this. That is absolutely critical. But apart from that, I think the industry itself needs to make their own commitment to reduce emissions, quite apart from what policy, good policy, will enable. I actually think that Kris didn't call it a subsidy, he called it a tax credit. I personally think a subsidy is extremely appropriate in these circumstances. Tax credit, okay, it's not technically exactly a subsidy, but it's a form of subsidizing a piece of business that we believe is in the general interest of our global citizens. I'm going to mention a couple other things, though, that I think are really important that the oil and gas business can do on our own. We're talking about CO2. Well, what about methane? This is an issue that the entire oil and gas industry can embrace and fix in many ways themselves. The methane emissions across, studies in Texas, for example, they're set up in essentially a Pareto distribution. About 20% of the bad boys emit 80% of the emissions. And so it's a very tractable problem to solve, and one that the oil and gas industry needs to embrace. Of course, we're all aware that the greenhouse effect of methane is much, much stronger than that of CO2, albeit its residence time in the atmosphere is going to be less. That's one thing. Secondly is the oil and gas business, quite apart from emissions, because we got to keep a view of what the future with regards to the business should look like, needs to think in the context of sustainable development. Here in the United States, we have 3.2 million orphan wells. We can't do that. Those are actually methane emitters. That's a legacy, a long, long legacy of the business. So approaching extractive industries, and this goes to mining, of course, as well, with a sustainable mindset is really important. And the last thing I'm going to say is the oil and gas industry can do a certain amount, control scope 1 and 2 emissions, but scope 3 emissions are you and me. That's the issue of personal accountability. So we have to embrace as citizens, and we have to be convinced to embrace as citizens, or incentivized to embrace as citizens, doing our role in limiting emissions.
Thank you. Merlin?
Yeah, well, it's hard to build on this, but I'll definitely touch a little bit on the regulation side and bring it to Mexico. Our industry, as it is, as I mentioned, we just had, it's less than a decade since we opened it up for foreign investment. And so the regulatory framework is still new and it's maturing. And as it matures, it requires a lot of polishing around those rough edges. And that's something that we're working today. So that's, I mean, going back to your question about what are the biggest challenges, this is a challenge, no doubt. I mean, we're also now facing, this year, we're going to start the carbon market in Mexico. And that, I mean, we've had a prototype of this for the past few years now. How is that going to work? Is it going to be really useful towards those long-term sustainable goals? Well, that remains to be seen as everything matures, as I'm saying. The other one previously mentioned as well, one of the biggest challenges is certainty. Obviously, I mean, the rule of law, having a government and different stakeholders being able to ensure that you know what you're doing today is going to have the certainty that tomorrow you're not going to be phased out by some other means. As you know, all of these projects, their life cycle for having a profitable investment, it takes decades, sometimes 4 or 5 decades. So definitely the rule of law can be a challenge. Shale, I'll just bring it to Mexico. Shale is basically a taboo here. We're not doing much about it. Why? Because there's a misconception that basically whatever happened in that documentary, Gasland, it's going to happen everywhere across Mexico. And things have evolved. Technology has evolved. Everything has shifted along, but the mindset here has not. So we need to work towards ensuring that everybody within around it knows that this is that basically best practices have evolved. And the last that has not been mentioned much, but it is a challenge, is and talking about paradigm shifts, is energy interdependence. And I'll bring it to the region that we are here with Canada, the US, and Mexico, and also a sort of a pivot from what is happening in Russia with Ukraine. Why? Because the whole thing about the energy dependence now, it's starting to brew. People are talking about, I need to produce and consume my own resources. I should not depend on somebody else, because you know what is just happening right now. Are we going to close the taps on the Russian gas? And what does that mean for everybody else? No. So we do need to start talking about energy interdependence, not only in terms of you sell, I buy, I sell, you buy. We need to be talking about energy interdependence into how are we going to go and row our boats towards long-term sustainability. I mean, Richard just talked about orphan wells. That's not an issue which is US focus centric. That's an issue that is worldwide. And how we're going to tackle that, and what are the best ways towards that. And that sort of interdependence is the one that we need to be focusing on right now, and leveraging those best practices. That today is not part of the discussion, and it is a challenge to bring it forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So we also have some questions from the audience. So there are so many of them, so I'll just have to pick a few of them. One of them is about the use of oil and gas also for transportation, because we know oil and gas sector has certain emissions, but the next biggest one is transportation, right? So is there anything that, what do you think that needs to be done to, pace up that reduction? And also, what do people actually are more willing to, like, basically consumer preference, right? More willing to switch to electric vehicles, for example, right? So that would have an impact on the demand for oil and gas. So what are your thoughts on that?
Maybe I could just jump in and offer a few thoughts on this, because obviously I'm quite involved in this topic with my business. And it comes back, Richard made a very important point, right? Scope 3 emissions, 80% is of the emissions sitting with the actual combustion of the fuel and in transportation modes. It doesn't mean that we as industry don't have a role to play in helping drive that down, but it really is about the consumer at the end of the day and the use of the fuel. I think the challenge is going to be, different modes of transportation. Let's just talk about vehicles for a second. And I think that's really the one a lot of people focus on. And it's electrification of the vehicle fleet. How fast can it happen? And I think there's real challenges and barriers. And we see it in Canada. We've got about 4% penetration electric vehicles. People like to always use Norway as the example, but Norway is a very different environment than the United States, or as an example, or Canada. We will electrify the fleet over time. The question becomes, how fast can you electrify that fleet? It's not just about the vehicles, it's about the infrastructure for charging, it's about consumer preference. I think this is one of the reasons why low carbon fuel standards, and just talked about, is about can we lower the carbon intensity of the liquid fuels that are going to be used for the decades to come, and the technologies that can be employed, whether it's in the inputs in the refining side. As an example, we have an investment for clean hydrogen as an input into our Edmonton refinery that'll lower the carbon intensity of the fuel we produce, to next generation renewable fuels. But there's a lot of challenges. It's about the energy infrastructure that exists today. It's about consumer preference. It's about how fast can you change over. And then you get into other modes of transportation, which become even more difficult to decarbonize, like heavy transportation, marine, and air transportation. And so these have solutions. The solutions look different in each one, and it's going to take time and the right investment and change of infrastructure. And it'll be interesting. The last thing I'll just say is, in Canada, the federal government put in a mandate, that 100% of vehicle sales will be electric by 2035. It will be interesting to see the challenges between here and there, and whether that can be achieved or not. I'm not saying that is a bad piece of policy necessarily, but there's a lot of barriers to get that done in a 10-year time frame.
I will just add on to that. I mean, of course, Kris mentioned electrification. Of course, the other critical piece of this is battery technology. So, you know, you electrify the fleet, but you have to have vehicles that go sufficient distance so that, you know, I live in Texas. I do very definitely have range anxiety. So I worry about things like how far can I go on a single charge. But I think, I will tell you, I think electric cars are incredibly cool. If any of you have driven them, they are super high performance vehicle. An electric motor has the kind of torque that will blow an internal combustion engine away. But you can't, not everybody can get one. They're expensive right now. However, this competition between making internal combustion engines more efficient and electric vehicles is a good one for both. It is literally steel sharpening steel. And that competition, one way or another, is going to drive us to higher and higher energy efficiencies.
Thank you. So maybe we'll also have the next question, and maybe Merlin, you can address that at least to start. So what is the best way, both in terms of like short-term and long-term, to fulfill our needs and also to reduce the environmental impact from oil and gas production? Like we talk about a lot of the things that can happen long-term, but I guess also shorter term, right? What do you think may be something that we can work on, for example?
In the short term?
Short term and also compared to the long term, yeah.
Yeah, you know, when you mentioned about how the oil and gas industry can help, and I was mentioning previously also the life cycles. If you look at the amount of oil and gas that comes online from a deep water project, it can take from 10 to 15 years. So what can we do in terms of you know, now today, we could foster bidding rounds that have the best practices in place to have those, you know, be able to benefit in 10 to 15 years. Now, if we were to, you know, shift from oil to gas, and that's something that we want to have in our energy matrix because it's lower carbon and all of those benefits that we've been talking about, you know, in terms of producing electricity. Shale is the best way to go. It has a lower life cycle than the rest of the fuels. You know, it's been proven the source rock is there, and so in terms of geological risk, it's not that much. So definitely that is the best way to go in terms of short cycle. Now, from a year-to-year basis, and this is something that the Mexican regulation does have, for any of your facilities, you need to have this leak detection and repair, the LDAR, no? And you need to be able to reduce your emissions, fugitive emissions primarily on a year-to-year basis, no? So intensity in terms of what you're doing and reducing your carbon footprint, that can be done. The technology is there, and there I would say that all of the stakeholders are aligned that it can be improved, and that has very short term benefits for everybody involved now.
There's also another question.
Juliana, one thing to add is, I mean, everybody should know we don't use 2/3 of the energy that's actually generated. We use 1/3 of that. So just think of that as an enormous prize, not immediate, but relatively near term, and that is efficiency as a theme. It's not necessarily absolute consumption, but efficiency as a theme for gain.
Thank you. So I guess along that line, we talk about decarbonization and the important role that carbon storage plays. So how much does this decarbonization actually relies on carbon storage?
A lot. I will just say.
So sorry. Oh, go ahead, Richard.
Kris, you
no,
go.
I was playing with my mute button.
A lot.
I was saying, well, yeah, I'd say a lot, but it's only part of the solution, right? And I wouldn't say it's the majority of the solution necessarily globally, but it's a big component. And I'll bring it back to the Canadian example, the oil sands example that I gave earlier. Like if we can move forward with what's been envisioned by the Pathways Alliance, 30 to 40 megatons of sequestration out of 70 megatons is a huge component of it. However, not every place has the ability for carbon capture and sequestration. You need the geology, right? You need the technical capability. The oil sands is also, it's a manufacturing process, so the carbon is quite concentrated, I'd say, the CO2. Carbon capture and sequestration is a tougher thing in offshore. It isn't impossible, but you need it in the right places, as an example. So it isn't a silver bullet, but it's definitely, I think, a major tool in our toolkit, and an important one that should be well supported, because it can actually make scale advances in carbon reduction or decarbonization while we work on all the other pieces of the toolkit, such as energy efficiency, as Richard said, or in the oil sands solvent technology. Julianne, I heard you work on that, but that's my view on carbon capture. Richard, does that?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's the technology's there. The cost is not supported currently adequately by policy, and that's going to enable that piece of it. And you can't do it everywhere. That is true. So, it's a wedge. It's one piece of what you can do to improve the situation.
And then maybe one more question we have. It's kind of interesting. Has anyone did some calculations on about the decommissioning, cleanup, and removal of millions of these vehicles, refineries and pipelines, oil wells, petrol stations across the world, and who paid for that cost? And I presume that would also have CO2 emissions, right? And so would that essentially lead to these similar problems like our open wells, right? So what are your thoughts on that, or any insights?
Yeah, perhaps I can start here. And this is the fact that we have so many legacy wells and orphan wells. In here, I mean, the last 70 years or 75 or so have been led by Pemex. So it is a nationwide problem today. Why? Because that's a national oil company. Now, what are we doing to target future problems such as this, and where is policy moving alongside the industry? Is today you need to set up a trust. As soon as you're going to start developing a field, you need to go side by side with a trust that you're basically chipping in part of the revenues from your development in order to have money, basically, so that by the end of this, you'll be able to abandon properly the oil wells. Now, so I would say that for new greenfield, even brownfield developments, this is being tackled today. The problem is for legacy wells that we don't have much information about inclusive. What are we doing here in Mexico, and how are we thinking about tackling? As everybody, we start with super emitters and reduce the scale of how we're going to tackle the problem. So we've had satellite images to detect the biggest orphan wells. We then have flights throughout the areas, and then we're starting to develop. But obviously, we're going to talking about Pareto, we're going to tackle perhaps 80%. The problem that we still haven't reached those solutions is what are we going to do with the low intensity orphan wells, and who's going to pay for that sort of remediation? That remains to be seen and tackled, and that's something that we would love to cooperate with other entities throughout the world to see what are the best practices.
Could I maybe add one thought? But by the way, I have no idea what the answer to that question is. I've never seen it calculated, but it's a great question. It's the nature of that question. I think it goes back to underlining the current infrastructure of our energy system and making the right choices as we move along, that we leverage the infrastructure we have to transition to the future. But I think there's another issue here too, and someone may have mentioned earlier, I can't remember if it was Merlin or Richard, but industry is very reluctant to invest in more infrastructure or future infrastructure. These long-term bets, these offshore projects, as Merlin said, 10, 15 years, the amount of investment, and you're seeing a reluctance, I think, for that investment with the uncertainty of the future. And what does that mean? It leads to potential supply crunches. And I think Richard might have mentioned earlier, even without what's the tragedy that's going on in the Ukraine right now, which is certainly having an effect on world energy prices, and the discussion around energy security that we're having now that we weren't having. Even before that, we were having issues of a supply crunch because the investment's not going into the industry, in the infrastructure that's needed. And I think that is a big issue that needs to be really recognized.
Juliana, I have to run, but I'll just add one thing to this, and that is we need to focus on what's called the circular economy. We need to be recycling more. We need to be more careful about what we consume, how we consume it, and then how we reuse what we consume. A completely new ethic. We've done it well for things like lead, but for the majority of things, we do it very poorly. I have to say goodbye. I'm sorry. So, bye-bye.
Bye, Richard.
Thank you. Richard has another speaking commitment after this one. So, yeah, I think that's kind of what some of the research, even within our future energy system, we look at life cycle, right? Like this, I guess this is even like a bigger scale. So we're kind of near the end. So I guess I would invite our executive director for the alumni relationships, Sean, to come back and maybe have a few closing remarks.
Well, thanks, Juliana. And thank you to Merlin, Kris, and of course, Richard, for an amazing conversation today. I can speak on behalf of our University of Alberta crowd and those viewers across the US and Mexico as well, that it was a fascinating discussion. And I think we could probably spend another hour or two, continuing. You see all of the questions in the Q&A chat, and I wish we could get to them all. But it sets the stage, I'm sure, for future conversations. To all of our viewers today, we encourage you to stay connected to the University of Alberta. There are many opportunities to get involved and stay connected virtually, so you can check out the alumni website on ualberta.ca for ideas. The recording of this webinar will be available for viewing on the University of Alberta website on both the on-demand page on the alumni website and the Energy Systems webpage. All digital content is released on our social media channels first, so be sure to follow UAlberta Alumni on Facebook and Instagram. And I just wanted a quick thank you to our affinity partners, TD Insurance, Manulife, and First Foundation, whose support makes these events possible. So stay tuned for future North American Energy Dialogue events organized by the U of A, the University of Texas, and Tech de Monterrey. And thank you again, Kris, Merlin, Richard, and Juliana. We really appreciate everything today. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.